Hello Summoners and welcome to another Teamfight Tactics video. My name is Christoph and today we'll be going over one of the most requested topics, and it's one that even many seasoned players can't quite get the hang of. That's right, today we're going to be going over transitions. But first, I'd like to transition and tell you to click on that link below if you want to see huge improvements to your game and league, and now we include a Teamfight Tactics portion to our site as well. ProGuides will keep you up to date with the best builds, secret strategies, and shortcuts for winning more games, so make sure you check out our website using the description link below. Before we talk in depth about transitions, it's very important to acknowledge that just like every other aspect of Teamfight Tactics, there is no 100% win rate transition. There is no secret starting comp where you can buy specific champions and just automatically win the game. Everything in this video should only serve as a guide in helping with the decision-making that goes into making transitions, as your games can and will be very different. With that out of the way, let's start talking transitions. The first thing to note is that there are three main stages over the course of a game of TFT: the early game, the mid game, and the end game. Just as important as knowing they exist is being able to recognize which stage of the game you're playing in, so let's go ahead and break them down. First, we have the early game. As you might have guessed, this starts at the first PvP round. In the early game, a majority of the players will still be level 3 or level 4. Because of this, only Tier 1, Tier 2, and rarely Tier 3 champions are available to players. This means comps that are mostly composed of those units like nobles, wilds, or pirates are going to be extremely common during this stage of the game. Next is the mid-game, which will usually start when most players hit level 5 or 6, when players start to gain a chance at killing Tier 4 units. This is because many Tier 4 units allow certain synergies to go online, like ninjas or elementalists. Many of these synergies have stronger effects than those you'd find in the early game, and because of the higher tier units they use, they tend to do a lot more damage as well. At this stage of the game, you should be looking for the champs that will eventually form your endgame comp. Unless someone with an early game comp has really strong items to support them, they will often struggle against those mid-game comps. Finally, we have the end game. This will usually begin around the time that most players are level 7 or level 8, where players will have the board space to accommodate their final comps. These final comps will have multiple powerful synergies and will often have many Tier 4 or Tier 5 units. At this point, most players will be leveling to add in final pieces to round their comps out, or they will be rolling to upgrade their final comp. It's extremely common that the player who will go on to win the game has their winning comp by this point. Now that we know what the different stages of the game are, how do we actually transition from one to the next? The most common thing any good TFT player will tell you is to avoid forcing a strategy. One mistake a lot of new players make is going into a game before the carousel with the idea that they're going to end the game with something like a dragon, shapeshifter, demon, sorcerer comp. However, they spend most of the game taking damage while looking for those specific units and ultimately end up losing while wondering what they did wrong. Instead, it's important you don't tunnel and try to play with the roles you're given. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a game plan, it just means that you should be able to recognize when the roles aren't going your way. The transition from early game to mid game is definitely the more interesting of the two transitions players will make. This is because it's the time where players will make much more drastic transitions. Some of the champs a player starts with may have synergy with other champs they pick up, but it's entirely impossible that all three starting champs are completely unrelated to the comp a player has going into the mid game. It's especially important to remember that there are actually 4 different boards to pay attention to when you're planning out your transitions. The first one is your actual board, the second is your bench, the third is your shop, and the fourth is your item inventory. In addition to upgrading your champs on your actual board, in the early game, it's generally a good idea to fill your bench with pairs, upgrades of things you see often enough, and all-around good units. This will give you a foundation that will make your transition easier by making it more likely that you find something that has synergy with something else you have. Essentially, it will feel like you're building another whole team on your bench that will eventually replace your team on your board. You're less likely to have a high interest income in the early game, and you can always sell everything on your bench back for full value, assuming it's not an upgraded Tier 2 champ, so don't worry about the gold you spend on going wide. As we talked about earlier, many early game comps are made up of cheap units that for the most part will be weaker and irrelevant later on. This is why you should never be afraid to replace or sell them. Another mistake new players make is that they will hold on to champs way past their relevancy. Even if you manage to get a level 3 champ early on, it's possible that the utility you gain from another unit like Cho'Gath or Sejuani could be more useful for your team comp and will make it worth replacing. However, there are cases where it might be a good idea to keep a starting unit. For example, on your board, you might have a standard Garen Fiora Vayne core with a Lissandra on your bench that you bought the round before. Then, you see that Ashe is in your shop. At this point, you might start planning for a Glacier Ranger or Glacier Elementalist comp, and your Vayne would keep its value. The last factor in deciding what to transition to is your item inventory. Some comps function much better if they have certain items. For example, the Ranger comp we just mentioned would probably want a lot of attack speed with items like Zeke's Herald or Rapid Fire Cannon. Depending on what items you have, it might be a good idea to plan and build a comp around those items. Now that we know how to transition, when is it a good time to transition? Like we said earlier, many early game comps will struggle against developed mid-game comps, so one easy way for newer players to recognize that the stage of the game is shifting is when your comp that was doing well before suddenly stops winning or rounds become much closer than they were before. That's a surefire way to tell that it might be time to switch it up. Alternatively, you may have been building up that team on the bench and you just hit your last piece. This would be a good time to swap out. It may seem obvious, but the purpose of transitioning is to make your team stronger to win fights, or at least reduce the damage you take from losing so that you can survive until you can complete your comp. So a good rule of thumb is whenever you're taking a lot of damage, it's time to speed up your transition. Let's talk about transitioning from the mid-game to the late game. So how do you transition from these two stages of the game? The transition from the mid-game to the late game is often harder to recognize as they're usually more subtle and mostly involve buying more champs for your already active synergies. You'll very rarely see players make drastic changes to their comps here, as it is way more costly than making major changes in the early to mid-game transition. As we mentioned in the endgame explanation, the main difference from the mid-game is that the endgame will have more space, allowing for comps that take more champs to pull off. Continuing our example from earlier, in the mid-game you had Ashe, Lissandra, and Vayne. You decided to stick with that comp and managed to find Varus and Kindred, giving yourself the full Ranger buff. This is an extremely common position, and a transition from here should be extremely easy. You can decide to expand on that by buying Brand and Kennen/Anivia and going Elementalist. By buying Brand, you've also added Demon synergy to your comp, and depending on how the game is going, you might decide to level 8 and throw in a Karthus for the Phantom synergy. Or you could push for the Glacial buff you have between Ashe and Lissandra by buying Sejuani and Anivia for CC. Another option would be to replace the Lissandra with Volibear and filling out the rest of your comp with Brawlers to provide a stronger frontline and CC with Cho'Gath. The main point we're trying to demonstrate here is that you usually should have a strong core going into the endgame, and you're filling out slots to support that core. We should note that it's more important in the mid to late game transition to be scouting the other players' boards. This is because Tier 4 and Tier 5 champs are more relevant and their availability is much more limited than those of Tier 3 or less. This doesn't mean that if someone else has the champ you're looking for that you should just give up on that plan, but you have to acknowledge that it will be less likely for you to find that champ and then just have a backup plan in case you can't get it. One relevant example at the time of the release of this video is Akali. Akali is a very powerful pick right now, even outside of the extremely popular Ninja Assassin build. This means that everyone is trying to pick them up if they get the chance, and there are only 13 of each Tier 4 champs in the pool. If you see 7 or 8 of them already picked up, you will have an extremely low chance of finding one for yourself. In a case like this, you'll want to have a backup plan or even change your game plan completely. Like the early to mid-game transition, it's always a good idea to transition if you are under a lot of pressure and taking a lot of damage. However, if you find you're not really under pressure, you have plenty of time to econ up and level over a few rounds. This is generally the ideal situation, as it leaves you with plenty of gold to spend looking for the champs you want to upgrade. Depending on the situation, you might even have a huge enough lead that you can push even further by transitioning to the late game, while others may not even have finished their transition into the mid-game. This all depends on your awareness of your position and the other players. Let's recap some general tips in this video. Firstly, avoid trying to force a team comp. You may end up spending all game looking for champions that you just won't get. Secondly, don't focus too much on the econ. Econ is important, but in the early game you won't make too much interest off of income anyways, so go wide on your bench to give yourself the most options. And if you're under pressure and taking a lot of damage, it's time to transition. Thirdly, don't be afraid to sell early game champs if they don't fit your comp. Early game champs tend to be weaker than the ones you'll find later on, so be sure to recognize this and replace champs as necessary. Fourth, try to buy strong units as they become available and build around them. This goes with tip number 1, you want to be flexible and play with what you're dealt. Pay attention to the meta and recognize which champs show up in your store. Number 5, start planning your mid to end game transition while making your early to mid game transition. Most mid to end game transitions are just improvements to your comp you'll form in the early to mid game transition. Think about what champs you'll add and when you'll get more slots to fully round out your comp. 6, always consider how the items you've been given fit into your planned team comp. Certain items are incredibly powerful with certain comps and may warrant trying to build a comp based on having those items alone. On the other hand, the items you have may be completely useless for another comp, so remember that if you still decide to build that comp. That's all you should need to know for transitioning in TFT. Hopefully this guide helped you guys understand transitions a little better, and once again be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit ProGuides.com for more content on teamfight tactics. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Good luck in your next few games, and we'll see you on the Rift.